Welcome to Beyond the Balance Sheet, the podcast that helps advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families understand the complexities of issues related to our mental, physical, and emotional well-being. Our co-hosts, Arden O'Connor and Diana Clark, will interview a series of guests on a range of topics, providing informative content and practical tools for professionals and families to consider. Here are your hosts, Arden and Diana.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Beyond the Balance Sheet podcast. I'm one of the hosts, Arden O'Connor, and I'm joined today by Bill Messenger. Bill, thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, I'm happy to be here, Arden.
So I enjoy introducing all of our guests, but I feel like I have the special honor and privilege. And before I read your extensive bio, Bill, I just have to say, as a young person entering the field, or maybe someone who likes to think of herself as young, you were an incredible mentor to me and really introduced me to, frankly, exactly the issues that this podcast deals with: addiction, family dynamics, and affluence. And anytime somebody asks me about my entrance into the field or how I got into serving the population I reference our relationship and the kind work that you did to sort of shepherd me through various conferences and referral sources and even help us flush out our business model. So a big thank you before we even begin.
Well, you're welcome. You're doing a great job, and you've done much more than I've ever done. So I really respect how you contributed to the field. So I thank you for your work.
Thank you. I don't know if that's true, but we'll dive in. So Bill is a retired lawyer and an alcohol counselor. He grew up in a family business, and on the side, he dealt with trust in estates and alcoholism, both in his personal and his professional journey. After completing treatment in 1995, Bill was surprised at the high relapse rate and the lack of efficacy offered by treatment centers. He began applying the models that are used, the successful models used for pilots and physicians who go into recovery. And he started trying to figure out how to apply those to families, including families that are coming from wealthy backgrounds, who are high profile in their communities, to try and increase what we know are not great recovery rates, which, Bill, you mentioned the article that was recently produced by the New York Times that addresses this very issue. Bill is a leading expert on what works for recovery for the affluent, and he's very prominent and has written a number of articles. I've been honored to be your co-author on a couple of those in Trust and Estates magazines. I also know that you're an advocate for treatment reform in the current system, trying to figure out better ways to find efficacy through the treatment that is offered in facilities. And trying to figure out what kind of community-based alternatives might be available, which was very much the basis of O'Connor Professional Group, our company. And I think one of the things I've always admired is your ability to look at what the economic drivers are in the business of treatment and figuring out how do we better align those with how we get families to a better place to have long-term recovery. So we're going to jump right into the main topic that we get asked about from all of our clients, which is, do affluent people have higher rates of substance use, and why? What's the reason behind it, given their enormous financial resources?
That's a great question. I think it's something that people have thought about because there's a great deal of secrecy in wealthy families, and so people really don't talk oftentimes about the addiction issues. But I would say, in my experience, in my family, our addiction rates for alcoholism were around 50%. And that includes my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and some in siblings, and also in the more general families that I am affiliated with, in-laws, outlaws, etc. I would say it's 20 to 30%, and either mental health, addiction, alcoholism, etc. And so what happens is the family gets organized around the people with the problems, and so the people who don't have the problems, who are thriving, oftentimes get left out of the family dynamic, in the sense that they're doing well and they're kind of ignored, and the problem family members get all the attention. It's very, I think people, the standard response has always been, well, let's send a person off to 28-day inpatient. If that's not successful, send them back to 28 inpatient, then they go to a halfway house. And that was a dynamic that I saw when I was in St. Paul. I live in St. Paul and Minneapolis, a lot of people coming out from out of town to treatment centers, then staying in Minneapolis, trying to recover, and then oftentimes, unfortunately, relapsing and sometimes dying. And so I was trying to figure out like what's going on in the system that it doesn't work for many people, most people, but particularly for the more affluent, well-off, well-known. And so I began to, think about that as part of my own recovery, because when I went through treatment, as Arden mentioned, almost everybody I went through treatment with, my peer group, relapsed, and I was kind of surprised to see that. And then I discovered several years later that the airline pilots have very, very high recovery rates because they have a different recovery model, and that's the model that Arden was referring to as something that we try to use in working with families. So I think the key is thinking of addiction as a chronic long-term disease that needs management over many years. And so it's not episodic. It doesn't get fixed in 30 days or 40 days or 60 days. It has to be managed over the long term. And I think that's the key for all families, including affluent families. We just need to manage that recovery process over the long term with help with professional advisors. So I think we can talk about that a little more, but I think we can also talk about my experience in treatment, which is, if you want to talk about that a little bit, I think one of the key aspects of treatment for anybody is to be able to tell your story, be accepted for who you are. And I think more affluent people, when they're in treatment, or professional people, don't want to tell their story because they're afraid of negative feedback. And so they don't really get the benefits of recovery because they don't actually tell their whole story to others and be accepted for who they are. They make up stories, or they don't tell the whole truth about their lives, and they don't get the benefit of being feeling like they fit in with the group, so to speak.
So let's go through that thread a little bit, Bill, because I think it's an important one. I mean, we know stigma exists around substance use anyway. I think if we've seen anything in the last 5 years, it's that there's more coverage by mainstream media outlets about the mental health, of our population, and even rising substance use rate amongst those both who have addictive disorders and, frankly, those who were isolated during the pandemic and were just drinking way beyond what are considered moderate drinking norms. I guess my question to you is, what is the stigma with affluent people? Why are they afraid to share their story? What is the nervousness? Why are they reluctant to go to self-help groups like Al-Anon? And what do treatment centers or other types of providers need to do to decrease their nervousness?
Well, I mean, I think part of the concern, and I saw that both as an intern in a treatment center and being in a treatment center myself, is there's a lot of what's called wealthism. Joni Bronfman coined that phrase, wealthism, which is resentment against the wealthy. And I could see that in these treatment centers. It's in AA. It's in a lot of recovery groups. There's just a lot of resentment against people who have money, and it becomes a therapeutic issue in treatment if the treatment providers and the peers don't like people with money, or people who are affluent, or otherwise believe that they're not deserving help. Then that's a big problem. So there's the prejudice against the wealthy that's kind of, I think, rampant in our society, and then it gets reflected in recovery groups and in treatment groups, in the treatment professionals. And so, I mean, that's a big issue. We're not going to settings where people, actually want to help us. And I think that's been a big detriment, particularly for younger people who go to treatment, and they come out and they relapse, and their parents don't really know why. And it's oftentimes because they're not comfortable in the treatment setting. They have people who are making fun of them, or otherwise they just don't say anything. They don't talk. And so they don't talk about their lives. They can't get better. So that's one issue, is just resentment against the wealthy. The second thing is that a lot of treatment centers don't understand that money is an integral part of our addiction process for people who are affluent, or actually anybody really, but for the affluent in particular. And you have to deal with how the financial system is supporting the addictive process, and then kind of untangle that and create a positive environment for recovery, which means, frankly, sometimes telling people, we're going to have to limit your access to resources until you take treatment seriously, because we don't want to see yourself killing yourself with all this. Money will allow the addiction to continue, and we don't want to see that. So that's the other thing. Treatment centers are not really good at trying to figure out how the addictive process is being supported. So that's the second factor.
So based on that, even talk a little bit about the consequences that wealthy people experience. I know when I share my brother's story, our behavior as a family was to rush in and save him. And we used lawyers and money and status and whatever connections we had to keep him in school or to try and make sure he was protected in a court hearing, so that he didn't suffer the consequences that an average person would. How do you think about consequences for wealthy people with addictive disorders, and how do they vary from those who are of more modest means?
Good question. So there's some data out there that shows that the more severe consequences you have from your use, more likely you're going to take your addiction seriously. So if you have a lot of consequences, jail, automobile accidents, lose your job, etc., you're more liable to think you have a problem than other people who can avoid those kinds of consequences. So money allows people to avoid the consequences of their use, and so it continues on and on and on. And meanwhile, the psychological, the physical, the health issues continue. So yes, families try to, and individuals have systems that help them avoid consequences of their alcohol use. Nannies, obviously lawyers, there's a whole system kind of set up to protect people from the consequences of driving while drinking if they have a lot of money, etc. So that's one of the big issues, is avoiding consequences. And also the family is many times interested in protecting reputations, etc. So they will work overboard to avoid consequences. And my big thing is, let's create consequences, or let the natural consequences happen. And so, Arden, we've talked about this a little bit, but for trusts, for example, there should be a clause in every trust that reduces access to funds if there's an addiction problem, and allows the trustee to hire experts to help him or her work through what the beneficiary needs for recovery. So similarly, I think families have to figure out ways to make sure that if somebody has an alcohol or drug problem, or actually any other behavioral health problem, there's some consequences for that, and that they address it directly.
So one of the articles I rely on a lot, you define explicit versus non-explicit leverage. And so where I think our toughest cases come in, as you mentioned, in a trust case, or in a case where there's a young person who's financially dependent on their family, even a not so young person, but somebody who's in their 40s, 50s, hasn't worked, but depends on a distribution, and there's some flexibility in the trust, it's a little bit easier to gain that leverage. Where it's been more difficult are cases where there's a trust that is not as flexible, and or a highly functional individual who outwardly looks very successful. They're running a business, they're the patriarch of a big family, and perhaps their wife is not at a place where, I'm giving a generic example, wife is not at a place where she's going to divorce or take any major action. What do you do in those cases where the leverage or the consequences harder to define based on the person's position in the world?
Yes. So there are two parts to that, actually, because we really haven't talked about leverage. So we refer to incentives. So what really works for recovery these days is something called incentive-based management. And so if you create some incentives for people to comply with their treatment program, it turns out that works better than no incentives. So just letting a person try to recover on their own is not successful. That's one of the reasons we have such low recovery rates. That 12% in the New York Times article, I think, is fairly accurate. And so now the new approach is, let's use incentives to try to encourage people to comply with their treatment programs. And of course, that's what the doctors and the pilots have to do, because unless they comply with their treatment recommendations, they can't get their license returned to them to fly or practice medicine. So incentives and leverage are important, and we try to find ways to encourage people to comply with their treatment recommendations by using either money, access to resources, or a little bit of help in early recovery. So the problem you're saying is when there's no leverage, when you have somebody's just on their own, it's going to be very difficult and situation, and you have to find other ways of trying to impact that person. I know that for some senior citizens, taking videotapes of them when they might be drinking too much helps. Then you can kind of maybe play it back to them. There are other things people do, other efforts. Sometimes they're really out of control. You hire somebody to be with them to make sure they're safe. But it's for the seniors, for the older family member where there's not a lot of leverage, there's not too much you can do except I think try to stay in dialogue with them about some of the effects of what their impact on their grandchildren or a community, maybe reputational concerns will affect them. So,
I mean, that I think we're seeing a larger percentage of our clients coming in that baby boomer generation who are aging and are struggling with substance use. And many of them, it's due to a lack of identity, a sense of purpose they found through work. And now what was a 5 o'clock couple of cocktails at the end of the day, it's starting earlier in the day, and it's more out of control use, and or they're metabolizing the alcohol differently because of other medications that they're on. And so to your point, it's, I think, a hard demographic to address. Some of the things you've said, you've mentioned, we've used. I think we've seen people who have actually restricted access to grandchildren. We've also seen medical interventions as successful at times. If you have a very active concierge physician who can come in and talk about, what their labs actually look like and blood work in a very data-driven way. People who are getting close to cirrhosis of the liver, as sad as that is, sometimes that creates some impetus for someone to think about change.
Yes, and I think the medical intervention is a really good idea. And I think now they're using more brain scans. You can say, let's take a look at your brain. We're worried about the status for potential dementia or whatever, an excuse to go visit the doctor. And then the doctor says, geez, I look at this brain scan. It looks like you're deteriorated substantially. And that's a reflection of alcohol use. So some people that can it's a wake up call. And for the brain scan can be very helpful. Other people, it's not. The doctor doesn't have a lot of influence, and they change doctors. So, but I'm totally. I mean, I have two very close relatives who are older, and they just continue on drinking, and nothing stops them, and it's difficult. So, but you can sometimes hire that companion to be with them while they're make sure they're safe, and that may help, but that's about it. So.
Yeah, more of a harm reduction at best approach. So I'm going to switch gears for a minute and then come back at the end to an issue we talked about that I know it's important to your heart around system failures and how we do better as an industry. But to start off, if I know some of the people listening to our podcast work in the wealth management profession or they're family office professionals, how do folks like this who are not trained clinical professionals, how do they make a difference, or how do they intervene, so to speak, with their clients who may be struggling with a substance use disorder?
Yes, and so this is something we've talked about before, but a lot of people in the wealth management business don't actually control access to the wealth. They manage the money. So they're not in a position to have any leverage whatsoever, and they're in the position of being good listeners. So oftentimes they end up being the confidant for the person that they're basically the relationship manager for in terms of finances and maybe some other things. But they, household affairs or whatever. And so they end up being kind of the personal confidant. And that is the best thing I think they can do is be a good listener and then try to find somebody who's an expert who can help them maybe steer the conversation in a direction that ends up with their client perhaps being willing to consider some resources. So the problem we have in our field is when everybody, there's a tendency to say, call up a treatment center if you want help, or go to Al-Anon or go to AA. But those solutions are not working in our field. And so, although some people really disagree with that, they think the current system works great. So, but I think for the relationship manager, it's trying to find a good resource, clinical resource, that they can trust, that they can help refer the client or maybe the client's family, if necessary, to for a consultation, and not try to solve the problems themselves. There's a tendency for relationship managers to want to be the go-to person for their client. In this area, addiction, mental health, that's not a successful approach in my experience.
What are your thoughts about, like, if it's not the person who's impacted by the substance use disorder, but the family that's resistant to addressing it? You know, somebody who's afraid to bring it up to their dad that he's drinking too much, or afraid to address it with a spouse. What is your advice, either if you're the relationship manager in a case like that or the family member themselves?
Well, I think the key here is for the family to come up with a kind of consensus as how to approach things, because you have family members with different ideas about what to do. The person with the problem is not going to respond well to one or two individual efforts, because they can always go to somebody else and say, well, they say I don't have a problem, or they don't like your approach. So the first thing that the family needs to do is kind of build consensus around how they need to move forward, and also hire an expert. Individuals have very little influence over a person in this situation, oftentimes because the family is not, working together, and so the family can be split by the alcoholic addict, which is very common. So, does that answer the question?
Absolutely. It's always the first place to start. I agree. If there's not consensus within the family, and there's not a motivation on the family side to make a change, and the individual isn't motivated, I always say, unless there's an external factor that's going to create chaos, a board of directors is going to fire the CEO who's an alcoholic, then, if 2 out of the 3 don't exist, and you have a third aspect that's not effective, we've got no ability to make any change, because usually the person with the disorder is not that motivated to change. So if the family's not motivated, you're really kind of stuck in terms of what possibilities exist.
And when we talk about the family system, it's larger than just the family. It's people who work for the family. It's people who have relationships. I think one of the weirdest things I ever heard is there's a woman who paid for her local liquor store owner's daughter to go to college, and to make sure she always had a supply of wine in her backyard. And so people couldn't figure out how she was getting this wine, and she had a secret connection. And cutting that off is kind of tough,
Of course.
So there's a lot of players involved, including people who are dependent on the person for money. There may be a wealth advisor or something who doesn't want to make a change. So it can be.
We see that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we see that, and we see it even when you mention the providers who need to educate themselves about dealing with wealthy people. I mean, sometimes the therapist in a small town where the family is a high-profile family, it can be tricky to tell somebody something they don't want to hear. They can want to keep the patient. They can say, I don't think you need to go to treatment, or I think this isn't as big of a deal as your family members say it, even if everyone around them is saying this is a catastrophe. And so these are the dynamics that are often not spoken about that make getting treatment and effective treatment even more difficult at times if you have lots of resources.
Right, because I think the professional clientele, the professionals in the field, whether it's a treatment field or advising field, they're worried about losing the client, because it's hard to get people with a lot of money as your clients. So they tread lightly in terms
Absolutely.
of the negative feedback. Yeah. So
I'm going to end on a question that I know is important to you, Bill, which is, I know you've been an advocate for treatment reform. You've been a staunch proponent of the pilot and physician model. tell us where the system is failing and what you think we could be doing better as an industry of professionals.
Well, I think first of all, the economic incentives are all in inpatient treatment. The inpatient treatment was $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 higher oftentimes for 30 days. And then you have the intervention field where somebody comes to your house and they say, pay us $5,000, $10,000 and we'll get try to get your loved one off to treatment. And so all the incentives are in the current system, which is to kind of break up the family, send a person off to treatment, return them home. There's little interaction between the treatment center and the family. There's HIPAAs used to kind of isolate the patient from the family. And so at the moment, I'm in a favor of detox. I think people need to be detoxed in a safe setting, go to detox for a few days and then come out and recover in the community. And I think the effort these days is on recovery management in the community. It's on there are different forms of the name, but it's recovery coaching. Recovery coaching. It's peer support, recovery management organizations, drug testing, accountability. There's some good apps out there that people are using. So that's really what I think where the action is. It's in the community, and it's with families getting a counselor and working with a counselor to help them support their loved ones as they continue in their efforts to recover. Because now the data is it may take 4 or 5, 6 treatments for a person to become stable. So we got to just understand that it's a long-term process. It's not going to get over in 30 days. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment.
Makes total sense.
Oh.
And it's been our experience as well, I think, for many wealthy people too, the model of being in the community and having flexibility as to where treatment is delivered fits with the requirements of the patient and sometimes even of that of the family. They want more say over the way treatment is delivered than what you often get in a residential program. And for us, it's not to say we don't ever send people to residential. It's sometimes the first place we start. But it isn't the only solution, which I think is what is the main thing we try to communicate to families. And oftentimes it needs to be combined with a longer term approach to get the results we want to see.
Yes, and I think the big issue is for families is like talking about all the relationships and how, for example, money might be supporting the addiction, how we can change that, how we can create positive wealth identities and, get the family all working together. And so you've got that other component that is missing from most treatment centers that you need help with. And I think, you guys are a group that does that. Some other people do it. I've been doing that. And I think families are really grateful for that support because they can't get that any other place. You can't get that in Al-Anon or AA because people just don't understand it. So don't understand it and they don't understand why it's a problem or, they resent it. I wish I had your problems type of thing. And so, they need specialized services that they're not getting now, and which I think is very important. So.
Absolutely. Well, Bill, thank you for being a guest today, and thank you for all the support you've given to me personally and to our company. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks to all our listeners and our watchers. We appreciate your support of Beyond the Balance Sheet. If you're so inclined, please feel free to go on your podcast platform of choice and give us a positive review. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Balance Sheet, a podcast designed to help advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families solve some of their biggest medical, psychiatric, and emotional challenges. Visit beyondthebalancesheet.com to read more about our guests and resources and sign up for our newsletter.